Hi, and thank you for joining me for another short talk. Friends, as the holiday of Purim rolls around again, we're confronted with a statement made by many rabbis of some obligation God has placed before us to, on one day a year, get drunk. And as you may already know, I have made videos in the past confronting and attacking this practice, but today, friends, I thought I would approach this case from a different perspective and finally put an end to the nonsense once and for all. I heard a rabbi once teach his students that God commands us yearly to get drunk. Actually, some rabbis extend this to many times a year with the phenomenon of the Fabregan, or even some include Simchas Torah, or even attending a Shalom Zachar. I remember when I was learning in yeshiva in Israel about 18 years ago, that my good friend of mine felt that he had a drinking problem. So he went to the local AA meeting in Yerushalayim. And when he came back to the dorm that night, he said, "Asher, you wouldn't believe it, but half of the yeshiva was there. Friends, we have a problem." Or even the many converts who, while religious Christians, never got drunk, only to be exposed to this despicable act by some rabbi, telling them that now, as a Jew, God commands you to get drunk. So one of the main reasons for this talk is, one, to help reconstruct Judaism's view on drunkenness, mainly because this makes our religion look ridiculous and ultimately stupid. And two, to help you understand halacha in a more accurate manner. Friends, I will start this talk by explaining the oral law. Now, I am reluctant to use that phrase, mainly because it only appears a handful of times in Talmudic literature, and it's many times misleading. Rather, I will use a term used by most of our sages, halacha. Because if we have some mandated obligation to get drunk on Purim, it should appear there. Now, to be clear, the Torah is against drunkenness of any kind, anytime. Examples like Noah, Lot, the wayward son, teaches us that this is something to be despised. Just to be clear. Now, regarding halakha, one major distinction made between rationalists and mystics in the Jewish world is where halachot actually come from. Mystics typically take the approach that all of halakha was given by God at Mount Sinai alongside the Chumash, the Torah, which at the end of the day really doesn't allow for distinctions between Tanaim, Amoraim, Midrashim, and Hagim. I mean, it all gets lumped together. But as people who have to try to intelligently explain our ideas, we don't have the luxury of using such language. So I'll give you the opinion that both history and most of the sages themselves gave for the origin of at least 98% of the body of halakha. And that's that it was voted into existence by the great court in Israel. Now, this court went by many names: the elders, the Kanim, the Beit Din HaGadol, in English, the great court, the Anshe Knesset HaGadol, the men of the Great Assembly, and ultimately the Sanhedrin. Regardless, this was the only group that had the authority to create halachot. This authority stemming from the pasuk in Parshat Shoftim of lo tasur, the command not to stray from the right or left of what this court instructs. And the rulings of this court only appear in the Mishnah. Now, it's true that we have what is known as the Braitot that mention Tanaic rulings that didn't make it into the Mishnah, but predominantly it is the Mishnah that is known as the source. And judges that appear in the Mishnah are known as Tanaim. Now, the authority of this court also contained what was known as Smicha, authority to judge going all the way back to Moses, right? We saw that in Torah, God says that he was going to put on the elders what he put on Moses and what Moses transferred over to Joshua, to Yehoshua. Now, the Talmud has another component to it known as the Gemara. Now, the Gemara, or Gemara, is only the commentary to the Mishnah, and the individuals within it are known as Amoraim. Now, at the time of the Amoraim, there was no temple and there was no court, and ultimately there was no smicha. Now, during the time of the early Amoraim, there existed a few who got smicha before it went away, but this smicha wasn't transferred on because of the dismantlement of the Sanhedrin, mainly because it couldn't be used to create new rulings. So, long story short, the Mishnah and the Tanaim give us the laws, and the Gemara and the Amoraim comment on those laws. Now, if I haven't lost you already, you must know that these distinctions are rarely made by rabbis today, especially the kind you find lecturing on YouTube, mainly because they don't know either. And because I refuse to treat my audience like children or walk idly by while some entry-level rabbi misrepresents what halakha actually is, or why we're commanded to keep them, here it is. Only the men of the Mishnah and earlier courts had the authority to establish halakha. That's it. And the job of Amoraim was to comment and in rare cases challenge those statements in the Mishnah with other sources from the time of the Mishnah like Braitot, or the Toseftot contained within them. Which means that anything said by Amoraim that is not confirming a Mishnah is only opinion and should be viewed as such. Now, why is this important? Well, all of us who defend rabbinic literature know that the bulk of the statements that the outside world typically has an issue with are not statements in the Mishnah, or even in the Braitot, or even in Midrashei Halacha, but comments mainly made by Amoraim, the commentators to the Mishnah. So you'd be surprised how many Amoraic opinions get told over as binding halakha, or legally binding halakha. Now, one could say that from a certain perspective, they are also halakha. They're statements made that impact how Jews address certain issues. However, they have no binding legal authority. I.e., when there was an actual court, no one would have been adjudicated for not keeping any law, not voted on or developed by that court. The problem is that the average person has a hard time distinguishing. They think that if something is said by a respected individual, that it should all be treated as if it was given by God himself. I mean, honestly, when was the last time you ever heard a rabbi make a distinction between opinions in the Talmud? Now, the distinctions are definitely made by more educated rabbis, but these are typically not the ones found on YouTube. No, friends, the response that is typically given by rabbis who either don't know or are too lazy to explain is that if it's in Shulchan Aruch, it's Torah Sheba'al Peh. Yes, it's easier to teach it like this, but is it accurate? And most important, does it produce better Jews? Look, don't get me wrong. When first learning Jewish law, you should start off with a codification of Jewish law like Mishneh Torah or even Shulchan Aruch, but then gradually graduate into a more Mishnaic mode of study, where you begin to ask who said what and what were they arguing against and when did this person live and who was the Tana and who was the Amara. Now, this could be applied to anything someone tells you is halakha. However, it's typically not, nor is it encouraged. They'll say, that's the halakha and that's it. Now, why is this phrase misleading? I.e., someone just saying it's the halakha, because the person hearing it would think that this means that it's absolutely binding, i.e., if there was another Sanhedrin, you would be found liable and adjudicated, and worse, that you were letting God down or disobeying God by not keeping it. That's what people hear when they think it's halakha. So, to go back to the initial message, how does this tie into Purim? Well, the source which people use as an excuse for drunkenness goes like this. In Megillah, the Talmud, the 7th daf, it says, Rava said, a person is obligated to become intoxicated with wine on Purim until one does not know how to distinguish between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. Okay, let's stop for a second. Now, who is Rava? Rava was a 4th century Amara who lived in Babylon. And he just makes a statement that one must drink on Purim. Now, he ties it into a midrash that teaches that Rabbah and Rabbi Zera prepared a Purim feast with each other, and they became intoxicated to the point that Rabbah arose and slaughtered Rabbi Zera. The next day, when he became sober and realized what he had done, Rabbah asked God for mercy and revived him. The next year, Rabbah said to Rabbi Zera, let us prepare the Purim feast with each other again. He then said to him, miracles do not happen each and every hour, and I do not want to undergo that experience again. And that's it. Now, mind you, this story is not in the Mishnah, nor is it dealing with any Tanaim or anything legal, but it is just a tale, a midrash, told over by one Amara about other Amoraim. I hope you understand the methodology, mainly because like this, you don't even need the use of Rishonim to further expound on the issue. So, only because someone uses the word obligated does that actually mean it's an obligation. This is why that throughout the centuries, even the Geonim never accepted this as some obligation to drink on Purim, at least on all of Israel, because they used the same methodology. And this is also why Rabbeinu Ephraim, the Baal HaMor, the Meiri, the Bach, and many more also felt that we as Jews had no such obligation. So, long story short, only because something is labeled a halakha in a later law code does not mean it's actually a binding halakha. And this, I believe, will be the hardest part of this lecture for many to understand. That in the world of rabbinic literature, there are binding halachas and, I guess one could say, optional halachas. And the optional halachas are really just advice from that specific codifier. Whether it was Savarayim who edited the Bavli or even the Rambam bringing medical advice of his day in Mishneh Torah, still labeling it all as halacha aleph or beis. So friends, instead of just saying that you should just do what your rabbi tells you to do or find a competent rabbi when you're confronted with difficult halachic circumstances, I choose to help you think in a halachic manner instead. Friends, for more information about everything Jewish, please visit TorahJudaism.com